Following the trail of terror. This is SkyWatchTV for Thursday, November 19th, 2015. I'm Derek Gilbert. A pre-dawn raid Wednesday morning in the Paris suburb of Saint-Denis led to a 7-hour confrontation between police and suspected terrorists, including the man that police believe responsible for the deadly attacks in Paris last Friday, 27-year-old Abdelhamid Abaoud. Witnesses said they could see bullets and laser beams outside their windows. 2 people were killed, 7 arrested. One of the dead was a woman who detonated a suicide bomb vest. Now, as of Wednesday afternoon, it's still not clear whether Abaoud was actually in the apartment building when it was raided. There are reports that he was not and has, in fact, escaped. This may have been another terrorist cell in the final stages of planning another terror attack. Now, there are a number of roads that lead from the tragedy Friday night in Paris into the future, and I will leave it to the major media to follow the nuts and bolts of the investigation into who was responsible and the search for those responsible. Rather than focusing on that, we'll look at a couple of other things. First, the political fallout. This may lead to a confrontation that's been brewing for quite some time between France and Germany. The European Union generally has been stepping in time to the beat of Angela Merkel's drum for quite some time. Eurozone economic policy, which affects all aspects of government policy, has been dictated by the Germans for some years now. Well, France is now vowing to spend as much as it takes to guarantee the security of its citizens, no matter how far above the EU debt ceilings they go. You see, the French still remember World War II, and they haven't forgotten how much they dislike being dictated to by Germans. Secondly, I talked yesterday about a nationalist political movement in France. This movement will grow and is not limited to France. It's breathing new life into political parties that have nationalist or anti-immigration agendas all across Europe. Besides the National Front in France, the UK Independence Party in England, similar movements exist in every nation in Europe. In fact, 9 countries in Europe are already governed by right-wing political parties with nationalist or anti-immigration policies, including Poland, Switzerland, Norway, and Belgium. In 2 other countries, Austria and Denmark, right-wing parties got more than 20% of the popular vote in the most recent popular national elections. Here in the U.S., as of Wednesday afternoon, it's manifesting in statements by 31 governors that they object to having Syrian refugees settled in their states. Some have issued executive orders directing state agencies to refuse to comply or assist with government resettlement efforts. However, it's not clear that those governors actually have the authority to prevent the federal government from doing it anyway. They can make it more difficult. Now, WBRZ television in Baton Rouge reported Tuesday that a Syrian man who had just settled in Louisiana had disappeared within a couple of days. Catholic Charities, which is the group helping to settle Syrian refugees in Louisiana, said they didn't know where he'd gone. Furthermore, it wasn't their job to track him. Well, the man was located Tuesday night, according to WBRZ, in Washington, D.C., where he had traveled to move in with relatives who already lived in the area. But this just points up another aspect of this story. Wednesday, FBI Director James Comey, in spite of assurances from the White House, told the House Committee on Homeland Security that the federal government does not have the manpower, the resources, to run thorough background checks on the 10,000 people the U.S. government wants to bring here, the Syrians fleeing from the fighting. 4 million people have left Syria because of the civil war over the last 4 years, understandably so. But most Middle Eastern countries refuse to take them in, which puts the burden on Europe and the United States. Now, we have to point out that the number of people who've lost their lives in terrorist attacks has been dramatically increasing in recent years. In 2014, that number was up 80% from the year before. 32,658 people lost their lives in terror attacks, according to the Global Terrorism Index. That's a study group at the University of Maryland. The number of deaths has increased substantially by a factor of 9 since 2000. Most of the deaths are concentrated in a couple of areas: Nigeria, thanks to Boko Haram, and in the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan mostly. As you can see, the Islamic State and its allies, like Boko Haram, are the ones mainly responsible for these deaths. Now, having said that, and being understandably concerned about the resettlement of people who have not been thoroughly vetted by the federal government here in the United States, there is perhaps one small bright spot that we as Christians should consider, especially since it appears the federal government will proceed with this resettlement, whether we want them to or not. This may be the only opportunity for many of these people coming to the United States to hear the gospel. The majority of them will be Muslims, based on the track record of the federal government so far. The vast majority of refugees that we have taken into this point are Muslim. This may be the first, maybe the only opportunity these people have had or will have to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm not suggesting that preaching to Muslims is an easy thing. It is not. But it is almost certain that had they remained in Syria or wherever they're from in the Middle East, they would not have heard the gospel at all. Now, technocrats, another aspect, another road leading from Paris into the future, are already worried about the growing backlash from nationalist and anti-immigration movements, people afraid of importing death into their neighborhoods by importing radical Islam. Obviously, nationalism and closed borders present major obstacles to the goal of a one-world government. The United Nations is already warning the nations of Europe not to backtrack on their promises to welcome refugees from the Middle East. This is, of course, ironic since Western elites, globalists, have been using radical Islamists as pawns in their global political chess game for decades. We've said before in this program, the United States essentially created the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in the 1970s and 1980s to fight the Russians who were occupying the nation then. Former KGB officer Alexander Litvinenko, who was killed with a lethal dose of radioactive polonium-110 a few years ago, told journalists that the Russian security service, the FSB, formerly the KGB, trained Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is now reportedly the head of Al-Qaeda and allegedly the mastermind of the attacks on 9/11. And if we want to look back 80 years, we see that the Nazis funded and facilitated the growth of radical Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood in particular. In fact, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, helped recruit Bosnian Muslims for the Waffen SS. Now, why would globalists do this? To push an agenda of regional and ultimately global government to fight the threat of Islamic terror. We saw hints of this earlier this week. Overtures by Western governments to Vladimir Putin at the G20 meetings in Turkey to cooperate in the fight against the Islamic State. And as I reported on November 4th, the UN is already going ahead with a biometric identity database in Geneva. They will tell us that this is necessary to avoid another tragedy like Paris. You remember earlier this week I mentioned that a Syrian passport had been discovered on the ground next to the body of one of the dead suicide bombers in Paris. Wednesday, authorities reported that at least 8 people have entered Europe with copies of that exact same passport. Now, it appears that the problem for globalists is when the jihadis take their jobs and their faith too seriously and begin killing people in those Western nations. This is a phenomenon that we here in the Ozarks, and I'll be delicate, refer to as relieving yourself where you eat. So it's led to a very interesting spectacle in the news this week of people who toe the government line, condemning the violence while avoiding all mention of who was actually responsible for funding and facilitating the growth of the groups responsible for the violence. In fact, in the spirit of never letting a good crisis go to waste, every interest across the political spectrum is taking to the airwaves this week to try to spin this tragedy for its own best interests. I already mentioned the nationalist and anti-immigration political parties. Liberals are using this story to prove that Western imperialism is responsible for global terror. Of course, we've also heard the claims by Senator Sanders and others that climate change is responsible, and so we need to reduce our carbon footprint to prevent further terror attacks. So-called conservatives and believers in the national security state here in the U.S. have seized on this attack to further the idea that NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden is a traitor who deserves to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The story goes that before Edward Snowden spilled the beans on the scope of the NSA's spying, that terrorists were very helpfully using unencrypted electronic communications and cell phones so that Western intelligence agencies could intercept their communications and stop wide-scale terror attacks. People who've made this claim in the last couple of days include CIA Director John Brennan, former CIA Director James Woolsey, London Mayor Boris Johnson, and even former George W. Bush Press Secretary Dana Perino, who tweeted her feelings in a almost profane statement of disgust. The problem with this idea is simply this. Edward Snowden didn't tell anybody who's been paying attention for the last 15 years anything that we didn't already know. Now, I'm an amateur at this. I don't have any secret intelligence sources, only what I read in the major media. And yet, my wife Sharon and I, on our podcast, PID Radio, reported the NSA's wide-scale surveillance in 2006, because USA Today was reporting on it in 2006. This was not news to anyone who's been paying attention. In fact, other mainstream media outlets like the Washington Post, 2 years before Edward Snowden revealed the scope of the NSA spying, that the reason Osama bin Laden was able to pull off 9/11 was because Al-Qaeda has known for decades to avoid electronic communication. Investigative journalist Glenn Greenwald points out that USA Today published a story in February of 2001, 7 months before 9/11, that terror groups were using web encryption to communicate to avoid surveillance methods used by the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, MI6, GCHQ, and other Western intelligence, military, and law enforcement agencies. So, when you start hearing stories about how Edward Snowden is a traitor and that Edward Snowden is responsible for Paris, keep that in mind. And when we're told that government surveillance keeps us safe, remember this also. A couple of other notes. A sad irony on the attack Friday night. The most deadly of the attacks was at the Bataclan Concert Hall, where the California band Eagles of Death Metal were performing. They were well into their set that night, 6 or 7 songs in. The band had just begun a song called Kiss the Devil when the attackers opened fire. The Dalai Lama is saying that God won't help us in this fight against radical Islamic terror because it's a problem created by humans, and so we humans will have to solve it. Any prayers asking God for help will be useless. With all due respect to the Dalai Lama, his problem is that he's praying to the wrong God. The hacking collective Anonymous says it's waging cyber war against ISIS. They claim they've taken down close to 6,000 Twitter accounts linked to ISIS since the attack Friday night. And that could be one reason that ISIS has apparently set up a 24-hour help desk. That's right, a hotline manned round the clock by senior ISIS operatives to help out young jihadists around the world with their tech problems. Hello, terrorist helpline. Can I help you? And finally, just because I feel we need one, a smile before we go. In a security breach at the G20 meetings, several stray cats commandeered the stage for their own nefarious purposes, brought a much-needed laugh to the gathering of world leaders. Although I can report that our personal chief of home yard security, Sam T. Doxson, now has these cats on his own watch list and swears they will not be resettled in the Ozarks. Tuesday on SkyWatch TV, we presented the final of our 5-part series on genetic Armageddon. Holistic veterinarian Dr. Gene Hoffe, who was consulted for the research behind the important new book, Dead Pets Don't Lie, discussing how what we feed our pets is actually changing the biology, the genetic expression of dogs and cats, and how what we're feeding them may actually be harming them. If you missed the program on the Christian Television Network Tuesday night, you can see it now on the SkyWatch TV channel on Roku, the SkyWatch TV channel on YouTube. We have a link to the YouTube channel at our website, skywatchtv.com, and instructions on how to add our Roku channel to your account at skywatchtv.com/Roku. Coming up Tuesday night, SkyWatch TV discusses The Babylon Code, a brand new book from Paul McGuire and Troy Anderson. They'll tell us about the prophetic cipher in the Bible that links global government and religion and the role of secret societies in making those end times prophecies come to pass. That's next Tuesday night on SkyWatch TV on the Christian Television Network, 8:30 p.m. Central Time, 9:30 Eastern Time. on SkyWatch TV. Registration continues for the 2016 Rocky Mountain International Prophecy Conference. Paul McGuire will be one of the speakers at the conference, by the way, along with Colonel Bob McGinnis, who was our guest on the program yesterday. 24 other top teachers, researchers, and authors in the fields of geopolitics and Bible prophecy: L.A. Marzulli, Bill Salas, Chuck Missler, Avi Lipkin, Joseph Farah, many others. More information and registration available at prophecywatchers.com. You know, for a guy who considers himself fairly adept at social media, I've been really slow in telling you how you can follow me on social media if you are so inclined. My own personal Twitter account and Facebook page. Free to follow me there if you like, and my website, derekpgilbert.com, and of course my email address for your comments, questions, and suggestions, dgilbert@skywatchtv.com. Thank you for watching. As we keep watch, I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is SkyWatch TV.